Good morning. Good morning. My name is Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues in the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. For those of you joining us for the first time, just give a quick word about where you're sitting. The Wilson Center is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson was the only president to have a PhD, and so recognizing his contributions to scholarship and to policy, Congress decided that in lieu of a monument on the mall, they would give him a think tank. So the Wilson Center strives to connect these worlds of scholarship, policy, and practice across many different disciplines. The Environmental Change and Security Program has been focusing at the intersection of health, environment, and security for more than 20 years here at the Wilson Center. Today's event is the third in a series that we're hosting with the Sustainable Water Partnership, a 5-year initiative to support USAID thought leadership, innovation, and action in global water security by integrating water security issues into mission programming around the world. Previous events have focused on too much water, too little water, and on May 30th, we'll have our final event in the series, and it will focus on uncertain or volatile water. We're so pleased to have Eric Viala, the director of the Sustainable Water Partnership and its chief of party, moderating today's event. Eric is a civil engineer with 25 years of international experience in water resource and irrigation engineering. He has worked in over 20 developing countries, including long stints in Bangladesh, Egypt, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and Morocco. And while he's a true expert on water, I can tell you that he has the rare and valuable ability to speak across sectors and perspectives and is well placed to lead today's discussion. One quick logistical note, today's event is being webcast live, so when it comes to the Q&A, please wait for a mic to be handed to you and give your name and affiliation before getting quickly to your question. It's a quick look at the participant list, shows that there's a lot of expertise in the room, so I hope that you'll be involved in the Q&A. So thank you very much, and Eric, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Lauren, and good morning, everyone, and welcome also to the people who are following us online. So the Sustainable Water Partnership is a USAID-funded program that was awarded a year and a half ago to Winrock and a team of partners. I'm going to quickly mention them: Tetra Tech, IUCN, M-Water, the Stockholm Environment Institute, the World Resource Institute, and the CEO Water Mandate. And the objective or the mandate of the Sustainable Water Partnership is to promote water security as a cross-sectoral development theme. We are doing that by advising USAID missions around the world on how to plan, design, and implement water security activities. We are also implementing in a couple of places. Right now we have activities in Cambodia, Kenya, Tanzania. We are starting an activity in Nepal, and we worked last year in Pakistan. Just a quick word, just to refresh memories, because I'm sure most of you are aware with the concept of water security. I'll start with an anecdote. About 2 years ago, I was chief of party of a USAID-funded WASH program in Ethiopia. And most of the program was about building rural water systems or rehabilitating water systems. And what was interesting, I discovered what rehabilitation means. It means basically replacing pumps and generators. So it means that systems that were built 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, at some point they went into disrepair, they became dysfunctional. And on one hand, you have a local government that doesn't have the resources, financial and technical, to maintain or repair those systems. On the other hand, you have local communities who don't necessarily understand the benefits and also don't have the resources or don't want to mobilize the resources to repair those systems. And without being philosophical, we in our field, we always have a bit that debate between humanitarian help and development. And this is a bit what's about, because at the end of the day, WASH is about saving lives. And the problem is that if we keep saving the same lives over and over and over, we are not getting anywhere. So the message I try to convey to my WASH colleague, because I don't consider myself as a WASH expert, is saving lives is great, but sometimes it's a bit like pouring water in a leaking bucket. And so let's look also at livelihoods. Let's try to have a more integrated approach to water management. And what I can add to that, beyond the technical sustainability and the financial sustainability, is also we need to look at managing the resource and what happens to all those lovely water systems we've built when the aquifer gets depleted or the river gets polluted. And that's actually it's the main topic today. It's talking about pollution. And I hope that at the end of this session, everybody will be convinced that managing decent water quality for drinking cannot be separated from managing decent water quality for all other users. And I think that's really the key message I want all of you to take away from today's discussions and presentations. Last thing I want to mention is that we have today a framework represented by the SDG number 6 that finally focuses on overall water management. So this is something that is very essential, that supports what we are trying to do in having a more integrated approach to water management. But we really need to make sure that resources are mobilized both by governments in developing countries and by donors to support that objective. And that leads me directly to the first presenter, Sasha Kuoshima. I hope I'm saying it properly. So Sasha comes from EPA, where she's the lead and senior advisor in International Water Program. She has also a very distinguished career, 25 years, just like me. And she's been focusing on the issues of water, environment, and sustainable economic development, which is very relevant. She worked previously at FAO, and she's been with the UN. She's worked with the UN World Water Development Reports, WHO. So she has a very broad experience, and I look forward to hearing from you, Sasha.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for coming here this morning. Good morning, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here. And thanks to the Wilson Center and the Sustainable Water Partnership for inviting me to present a 30,000 feet overview on the global water challenges for sustainable development. Much I will present will be on some statistics related to water quality from my perspective as a steering committee member under the Global Plan of Action in the Prevention of Land-Based Sources Pollution. So here, some of the global statistics, and many of you already know that the global water challenges are enormous, and water depletion and degradation are recognized as a potential destabilizing factor in global economy and security. Many of you have been involved with the U.S. government in the production of the global water strategy for the United States, and many of the goals are related to these water quantity and quality deterioration. We've heard the statistics over and over again that globally nearly 1 billion people still lack access to safe water and sanitation. In the emerging developing countries, children lose 443 million school days per year due to diseases related to water, sanitation, and hygiene. And with climate, the drought issue, including South Africa at the moment, across the globe costs about $6 to $8 billion a year from losses in agriculture and business. And the U.S. tourism industry alone loses nearly $1 billion a year due to nutrient pollution and harmful algal blooms. Fresh water, as we all know, is a limited water resource, and for which demand is growing practically everywhere. So nearly all human activities that require water, including domestic, industrial, commercial, agriculture, urban sectoral activities, all require additional water demand, and hence producing more wastewater unless we implement conservation practices. Much of this wastewater in the emerging countries have not been appropriately treated, so either in lack of pollution control regulations, also implementing them, technologies, and financing for water treatment infrastructures. The statistics are that the global population are expected to exceed 9 billion by 2050. Urban populations are expected to rise twice as fast, and 90% of this urban area discharging wastewater without any form of treatment. So in this graph, it shows the comparative between the treated and untreated water. The untreated is in orange for 10 different regions. As you can see, most of them are in the sub-Saharan Africa, some in the Caribbean, and Asian and Middle East. And over a fifth of the global population that I mentioned, 1.6 billion, are expected to live in the coastal cities, and creating more hypoxic zones, impacting 245,000 square kilometers of marine ecosystems, with subsequent declines in fisheries, livelihoods, and negatively impacting the rest of the food chain. And the world's hypoxic zones and eutrophic coastal areas are increasing and highlighted in red and yellow dots. Adding in a challenge of water scarcity, 2/3 of the world's population currently live in areas that experience water scarcity for at least 1 month a year. About 500 million people live in areas where consumption exceeds the renewable water resources by a factor of 2. Climate change scenarios exacerbate the water cycle dynamics, and discrepancies between water supply and demand are increasingly aggravated. Water-related events, as mentioned earlier, like floods and drought, account for 90% of the world's natural disasters. Since 2016, the World Economic Forum has identified the water crisis as a global crisis of highest concern for people and economies over the next 10 years. So the degradation of water quality, it is the availability of water resources is intrinsically linked to quality, and the areas here kind of highlighted the amount of pathogen, the severe pathogen affecting the 1/3 of all the river stretches in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, putting a lot of health burden in millions of people at risk. And children under 5 account for 42% of the 842,000 deaths per year related to contaminated water and sanitation. As Erica mentioned about the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has a more comprehensive goal for water, going beyond the issues of water sanitation and supply. The target 6.3 specifically states that by 2030, improve water quality by reducing pollution, eliminating dumping, and minimizing release of hazardous chemicals and materials, as well as having the proportion of untreated wastewater and substantially increasing recycling and safe reuse globally. So water connects all these other SDGs on health, food security, livable cities, energy for all, environmental well-being, and climate action. The SDGs make clear that the world needs to transform the way it manages water resources, as well as improve water and sanitation related services for billions of people. So wastewater, as well as water in general, have generally remained undervalued. And the shift in the perception of water and wastewater is happening. And many of the UN agencies have developed policy documents to demonstrate the true value of water. The FAO have published The Wealth of Waste, and UN Environment Program has published the economic valuation of wastewater a few years ago. EPA also has published value of water, and the high-level panel for water, which is the UN Secretary's convened panel at the heads of state and government level, has recently released their report promoting valuing water and improving water and sanitation-related services through innovation, partnerships, and infrastructure investments. Sustainable water management embraces basically low consumption, minimizing waste, pollution, and high use efficiency was highly emphasized at the World Water Forum. Happened just a couple weeks ago. And the action to improve wastewater management fall under the 4 R's indicated here on this slide. Reducing pollution at source. This includes point source and non-point source from agriculture practices, industrial, municipal, as well as stormwater management. removing contaminants from the wastewater flows and reuse the treated wastewater, and recovering useful byproducts, including energy conservation in treatment plants. Currently, the U.S. industry is rebranding the wastewater treatment plant to resource recovery facilities, and many other countries are doing the same. So there are a number of reuse scenarios and water quality requirements, the standards, the guidelines. The EPA has published a 2012 reuse guidelines, and just last year, direct and indirect potable reuse. And much of these have to be met for specific reuse, and now the term is fit for purpose reuse for irrigation, aquifer recharge, industrial cooling and processes, as well as direct potable reuse. So much of this is determined by standards and guidance. Managing water is intrinsically part of the entire water cycle management. However, the management of water after it has been used, such as wastewater, has mostly been hidden in a blind side of the water cycle. So in practice, the goal is to go beyond just pollution abatement, but to seek gain and value from wastewater and recognize the water energy food nexus. Biogas can also be captured in wastewater treatment plants for offsetting the energy cost in treatment. So the SDGs really is looking at the transformative aspect of total water cycle management. And also monitoring and reporting of pollution discharges and ambient water quality are also necessary for achieving progress. The latest UN Environment Assembly held just December of last year announced the water quality resolution for monitoring of water quality under the Global Environment Monitoring Initiative. I want to mention some about the cost recovery and appropriate financing mechanism. This is a challenge, not only for the developing world, but also for developed countries to address water treatment and pumping and aging infrastructure, as mentioned earlier, of water through the distribution channels, the asset management, and how do we do this appropriately, not only for investment, but maintenance and operations. At EPA, we have been partnering with MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, in providing the U.S. state revolving fund mechanism in institutional and fiscal capacity to low and medium developed countries such as Cabo Verde. And also with Inter-American Development Bank, UNEP, and the GEF, the Global Environment Facility funding, we have implemented revolving fund for wastewater management in 4 pilot countries in the Caribbean to develop sustainable financing mechanisms as well as legal regulatory framework for wastewater collection and treatment. And that project is going into a second phase with expanded countries. Building capacity and knowledge, it's important as we need data and information on water quality and wastewater generation for all the different sectors as mentioned, and adequate regulatory standards and controls is essential to develop national and institutional and local capacity and actions aimed at environmental protection and human health protections. Innovation and technological development has a place here in wastewater and water quality management. They're evolving rapidly, and the most pressing needs in terms of research and development, including increasing the affordability, which is important, and effectiveness of these processes, the upscaling of prototypes, and the dynamics and impacts of emerging pollutants. Even if reclaimed water projects are technically well designed and appear financially realizable and have incorporated approaches and appropriate safety measures, reuse schemes can still fail without public acceptance and awareness. So it is very important for planners to adequately account for the dynamics of social acceptance. Awareness raising and education tailored to the consumers and the general public with different cultural, religious backgrounds are the main tools to overcome these social, cultural, and consumer barriers. So with that, I leave you with a few takeaway messages, and I look forward to the subsequent presentations of this morning's excellent line of speakers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sasha, and I really appreciate the takeaway messages. I think it's always, your presentation was very exhaustive, refreshed my memory on a couple of things, but it's always difficult even when you take notes to grasp everything. So I really like that takeaway messages. That's something I try to do myself. So this being said, we'll take all the questions at the end. We are trying to run the panel rather swiftly so that there is enough time for discussion, for questions and the discussion at the end. So I'll move next to Robin Fisher, who serves as a Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer for WaterAid America. She works, of course, on WASH, working with the U.S. government, U.S. federal agencies to improve WASH services. And she's going to a topic that I touched upon at the beginning. She's going to talk on how to integrate WASH within the broader framework of water resource management and other development themes, because that's what it's about. Water security is cross-sectoral, and WASH is a big component of it, but WASH alone is not sustainable, so we need to look at water management, and then we need to look at the bigger picture. Like Sasha said, it links to socioeconomic development. And at the end, Sasha mentioned it quickly, but I'd like to emphasize it too, because it's very relevant. It's political stability we are talking about. Okay, thanks, Robin.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As Eric mentioned, I'm the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer for WaterAid America. Today, I'm going to be touching on the integration of WASH, clean water, and women's issues. The key points I hope to bring home today is to discuss time, poverty, and dignity, to mention how water and WASH are women's issues, and integrated approaches that also address gender-based discrimination are key for women to truly benefit. Next, I'll discuss water and WASH as are exacerbated by external stressors like climate change and have impacts on women's health and their well-being, but WASH can also serve to help with watershed protection. Next, water and WASH programs are optimal for entry points for women's leadership and economic empowerment, but we have to seize those opportunities. And lastly, I will provide some recommendations on ways to move forward and show and demonstrate how WASH is more than just saving lives, but actually a catalyst for good health and productive livelihoods. Yeah, please. And just to give you a bit of background, WaterAid is an international NGO that works in 37 countries around the world, aiming to improve access to clean water, adequate toilets, and hygiene services for the poorest and most marginalized communities. In addition to providing technical assistance, WaterAid has a policy and advocacy programs in each of those countries to help institutionalize WASH services at all levels. Sasha touched on the global water crisis, so I will gloss over some of these details and jump right into the first slide. I'm just going to be providing pictures and speaking, so no worries on jotting down whatever's on my slides. So as you all know, women carry the burden of fetching water for their households and generally have to walk miles to find a drinking water source. And it's not always safe, nor is it clean. UNICEF conducted a study throughout 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and recognized that women spent 16 million hours collecting water each day, which is almost 25% of their time. That same study found that men only spent 6 million hours collecting water. That time spent collecting this water is to the detriment of schooling or paid work, and has the potential health risks for women who repeatedly have to carry heavy containers over their head for long distances. And also in that same vein, women who travel long distances are at greater risk to gender-based violence. When women and girls are no longer in school, there is a heightened risk of early marriage and early pregnancy, low lifetime earning potential, low decision-making power and political participation, and all of which perpetuates the cycle of poverty. When we think of systems and technological advances to meet these needs, we have to recognize that large systems will not always address these concerns because many of these women in rural areas are not connected to a grid. They're not operating on pipe systems. Next, the lack of clean water also increases the likelihood of illness and missed opportunities. As Sasha pointed out, around the world, up to 443 million school days are lost every year because of water-related illness. Additionally, healthcare facilities that don't have access to clean water increases the likelihood of health issues for women, particularly during labor. Lastly, clean water is needed for women to tend to their hygiene needs, such as menstruation and hand washing. Addressing hygiene is absolutely critical if women and girls are to have the caregiving burden lifted and to lead healthy and productive lives. Essentially, clean water, decent toilets, and good hygiene are vital for living a safer, dignified, and healthier life. Next, I'm going to touch on climate change and watershed protection. Again, as Sasha mentioned, about 2/3 of the global population lives in a place that is already water stressed. When the changing climate causes extreme weather, it's the poorest people who suffer most, as they are the least able to prepare and to protect themselves. In these situations, women tend to suffer more due to the fact that they are responsible for collecting water and serve as primary caregivers in their home. Climate change does exacerbate the challenges of time poverty and access to safe drinking water, whether it's droughts, as seen as in the photo in the upper right, which is actually of a dried up rainwater collection system in Colombia, or due to intense flooding, as seen in the top left, which is a nearly flooded latrine in Nicaragua. Flooding threatens systems that haven't been constructed with resilience in mind. And flooded latrines and sewers can dramatically increase contaminants in water, resulting in cholera outbreaks like those we've recently seen in Yemen and Haiti. And it creates new breeding grounds for vectors of disease like dengue, yellow fever, malaria, and Zika. On the other hand, droughts mean women have to walk farther or to unknown places to collect water. This means more time, more vulnerability, and potentially less confidence about safety of the water source. To move forward, it's important to better integrate or to recognize that we must integrate WASH programs with watershed protection as a means to make communities more resilient to the impacts and reduce the burdens on women and girls. A stronger emphasis on constructing safe and resilient toilets, coupled with behavior change programs to get people to use those toilets, because if you build it, they won't necessarily show up. But this can all help to prevent the spread of fecal matter, especially when intense flooding occurs. This in turn can improve women's health and allow them to pursue educational and job opportunities, as well as safeguarding ecosystem functions of that watershed, in addition to the multiple uses that watershed would serve. As some of you may not know, a large gender gap still remains in women's access to decision-making and leadership. Women make up fewer elected representatives in most rural councils. In Asia, this ranges between 1.6% in Sri Lanka and 31% in Pakistan. Women's participation as chairs or heads in these rural councils is also much lower than men. As seen in Bangladesh, it's 0.2%, and Cambodia is 7%. In order to move forward efficiently and effectively, women must be directly involved in all aspects of the water value chain, from learning to construct a well to developing policies that manage and protect the quality and quantity of water resources. Their participation in design, implementation, and monitoring means more sustainable, more appropriate, and acceptable services, and their own safety needs will be prioritized, meaning they will receive better protection. Women can create a more equitable and participatory community and lead to more empowered female community members. I want to draw your attention to the photo on the left. As you can see, it's a woman pointing down with a stick. It's maybe not as clear, but the story behind this, WaterAid has a program in Burkina, specifically in Basbeiro, Burkina, and we essentially aimed to integrate WASH, water resource management, and under the umbrella of the impacts of climate change. The community was given easy and cheap tools to use that they themselves could replace and construct, and in service of monitoring their wells. This, as a result, allowed them to track rainwater rates as well as what the level of the water table was in each well. So seasonally, they were able to understand how much water they could pull from each well to still manage their water effectively, whether it be for in-home use, agriculture, livestock, or just simply hand washing. But the reason I want to draw your attention to this photo is that is a woman who is explaining this to all the men in the community. Women were at the forefront of this program and were leading the participatory efforts and happened to be some of the best monitors that we could have asked for in the program. And lastly, I'm just going to leave us with some recommendations. First, again, we must integrate wash and water resource management with an emphasis on gender mainstreaming. Too often, water protection is in competition with water, or at least is framed as people versus nature, people versus livelihoods. If we intend to meet the SDGs and really provide water for everyone everywhere, as well as protecting watersheds and the critical functions they provide, we must develop and implement integrated programs. We need to put women at the forefront as beneficiaries to help ensure that these programs address their needs, and particularly access to toilets and clean water for hygiene. The next recommendation is we must ensure women participate at all levels and all stages, whether they're policymakers, program managers, or pump mechanics. We must require it and create accountability for it. We also need to build in ways to capture lessons about how things are done differently when women engage, so we as implementers and practitioners can better meet their needs in the future. Third, we must take the human rights approach. A rights-based approach will prevent us from focusing too narrowly and missing program modifications that could improve outcomes for women and girls. And it will point toward multi-sectoral partnerships that we may need to accomplish these programs. We cannot skip basic access to WASH, or we will never reach universal access. 4, we have to follow the money. Investments must be appropriately targeted to the lower wealth quintiles and used for appropriate technologies to develop, resilient projects and services that will, help to lessen the impacts of climate change, adequately address the needs of rural, peri-urban, and urban communities. And the financial assistance needs to go to building systems that works for the poorest communities. Last, we must build a community of capacity to manage resources effectively. We need to make sure that they are able to meet their own needs for consumption and hygiene. We cannot reach everyone everywhere if we view water resource management as a means to only serve large agriculture or industry. We have to keep our minds on the true communities and the small communities in the rural populations that aren't necessarily on grids and require our services. With that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. I'll add a little word here, and I'll go a bit on my soapbox on this. In terms of the role of men and women, my experience working in over 25 countries is that, especially when you look at dirty water and pollution, men in general, they are breadwinners. All their decisions, most of their decisions, I'm being simplistic here, are based on money and feeding their family. That's a natural reflex for men. When you start talking about health, they don't really understand. They understand when somebody is sick in the family, but they don't understand the implications, the impact. They don't necessarily understand that it has also a money impact, among others. If you want to talk about pollution and health, you have to look at women. So I think there's a point to be made here in terms of there are so many countries. I've worked a long time in the Middle East. There are so many countries where those percentages, 0.2%, we really have to change that. We can't go on that way. And elevating the debate a little bit, elephant in the room, and sometimes people don't like to talk about that topic, but we need to address it, is population growth, okay, all over the world. Population keeps growing very fast. As I mentioned, Ethiopia 30 years ago, it was 30 million people. Today, it's 100 million people. In 30 years, it will be 150 million people. How are they going to feed those people? How are they going to provide jobs to all those people? It's possible. Let's not be pessimistic. It's an opportunity. Young people are an opportunity, new ideas, energy, etc. But maybe there are still places where we need to control a bit growth. And at the end of the day, it's all about women. It's all about girl education, okay? That's the field of my wife, so that's a field I know. But recently, 2 years ago, I was in Zambia visiting a school wash program. A big issue with girl education is retention, is keeping girls in school. When girls reach puberty, they drop out. We can understand why. There are still today in this world many wash programs that don't even mention menstrual hygiene. And to me, it's criminal not to have menstrual hygiene mentioned. In that program I visited in Zambia, if you build latrines and if you build wash stations, within 6 months, you have at least 25 to 50% more retention of teenage girls. That's massive. If those girls go to school, they are not going to get married and have kids when they are 13 or 14. This is essential. This is it. I'm a bit on my soapbox here, but I really want to make a point. I want all of you to help promote that idea that school wash is absolutely essential, okay? Especially looking at population growth, and it links to pollution and dirty water. So just a little bit of advocacy here. When we look at pollution, you know, we've been so far focusing a lot on pollution that comes from human waste, that comes from wastewater. But we need to broaden a bit the debate. First of all, there is one topic, I just want to mention it. We don't have a speaker for that topic, but it's solid waste, it's garbage. Garbage pollutes. Hazardous garbage also exists. There are many countries where even garbage from hospitals is dumped in nature, and that's very dangerous. But garbage is a source of pollution. We don't have a speaker about that, but I want to mention it. The other source of pollution is agriculture. We keep forgetting. It's very easy to forget that 70% or 80% of the water we use on Earth is to produce our food. And agriculture, like any human activity, pollutes. And that's also something that people have started realizing. And that's a topic that my colleague John Whiston is now going to address with also some ideas and solutions on how to address that agricultural pollution.
Thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate being part of this panel, and thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting this great series and for the Sustainable Water Partnership to help organize and put it on. The topic that I'm going to speak of today is somewhat different in the sense that the work that I've been doing on this topic, which has to do with agricultural pollution control, has mostly been in North America, in the United States and Canada. However, I think the concepts are applicable worldwide. And I'll make mention that I brought copies of several short articles and reports that give a little bit more detail than I'll be able to go into in this presentation. If anyone's interested, please see me afterwards. I'd be happy to share them with you in paper or electronic format. So I am an agricultural and environmental economist, and my work has mostly been on incentive mechanisms for agricultural pollution control. Most of you are familiar with WinRock to some degree, but the unit of WinRock that I work in is the Ecosystem Services Unit, which operates a bit differently than most of the rest of the organization. And essentially, we're a bunch of ecologists and economists and GIS and remote sensing technicians who are trying to apply science as best we can to help come up with some solutions to some problems, including water quality issues. So, of course, if we're talking about agriculture, we need to talk about the link between global food security and water quality. And so agriculture here in the US and in many parts of the world is the leading cause of water quality degradation. But obviously, agricultural productivity is incredibly important for global food security as we move forward. And so the issue really is that if you take an approach, a regulatory approach that's prescriptive to farmers, you'll generally, not always, but for the most part, constrain agricultural productivity. And that's problematic, I think, for food security. So what we really need are flexible and efficient solutions that help farmers to mitigate nutrient and sediment loss from their fields without being too disruptive to productivity. And that's essentially what our work is about. So the previous speakers, especially Sasha, was quite helpful in describing the problem, and I just have a couple slides I'll go through quickly. The hypoxic or dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, it's an incredibly large area that drains some of the most fertile agricultural land in the world, is causing a a hypoxic or dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which varies in size year to year, but is often around the size of the state of Connecticut. And the estimates are that 80% of the nitrogen and 71% of the phosphorus that are coming out of the mouth of the Mississippi River are originating from agricultural land. We're doing quite a bit of work right now in the Lake Erie watershed, and they have a terrible problem with harmful algal blooms. This, of course, made the national and international news in 2014 when the city of Toledo, Ohio, had to shut down its municipal water system because of toxic algae in the system. The Joint Action Plan for Lake Erie is calling for a 78% reduction in dissolved phosphorus inputs into the lake. And, of course, they recognize we need better targeting of best management practices, or BMPs. And again, that's the targeting of them is inherent in the approach that I'll describe to you of the work we're doing on this. Also, Tai Lake in China, a terrible problem with harmful algal blooms. Estimated that 60% of the nutrient inputs are coming from agriculture in that watershed. And I just came back from a water quality conference in Gdansk, Poland, that's focused on the Baltic Sea water quality, and there also eutrophication and algal bloom problems, same in the Black Sea. So the current approach, and this is in some ways specific to the US, but it's the same in Canada and it's the same in many places. It's a pay-for-practice approach. And there's good reason for it. I don't want to sound critical of this approach. Non-point source pollution, that does not come out of the end of a pipe, is extremely difficult and highly impractical to measure and monitor. So it's difficult to pay for performance. So really we have these approaches. In the US, the USDA spends over $5 billion per year in farmer payments to get them to try to implement some of these best management practices. And many farmers do, and those practices are good things, but it really becomes unknown how much nutrients are entering the waterway or how much these practices are mitigating nutrient loss into the waterways. The outcomes are not quantified to any real extent. And so my work as an economist is really focused on cost effectiveness. And it's frustrating because we can't really know the cost effectiveness of the baseline situation we're starting with. We assume that if we use information to pay for performance, we'll have better cost effectiveness, but we can't really know where we're starting from. And this approach, really, this approach of having some practices, which is essentially like coming to a farmer and saying, hey, we have some solutions to this problem. Would you be willing to implement some of them? And in most cases, even here in the US, and I think this would be true in many parts of the world, the farmers have not really been kept in the loop of what the problem is downstream. So they say, what problem? And to give them a canned solution and say, please implement this, is a little bit disjointed. Farmers tend to be really skilled problem solvers. I mean, farming is an activity where you generally have to solve problems all day long, in a sense. And so this approach doesn't really motivate farmers to help try to solve the problem. So the other really important concept here is that, and this is an obvious point, the landscape is diverse. In some places, extremely diverse, and in some places, subtly diverse. But regions are not the same, neighboring farms are not the same, and fields on the same farm are not the same. And if we take it even further, even in one field, you can have a section with high slopes, high soil nutrient levels compared to other parts of the same field. So information is essential if we really want to be smart about agricultural pollution control. So this approach that we've been working on for several years now, and I do have a couple of articles that describe the concept here, is pay for performance conservation. And so before I get into this graphic, I guess what I'll just say is that there are many examples of payment for ecosystem services, payment for environmental services programs, and this falls under that umbrella. However, the distinction I want to make is that many of those PES programs really are pay-for-practice programs. And we think if we get the practice on the land, then we'll get the ecosystem service that emanates from it. And I hope that's true in most cases. The subtle difference, or maybe not so subtle difference, is that if you're really paying for performance and you're quantifying performance, you're using information to take into account how the performance varies over the landscape. And therefore, the cost effectiveness varies over the landscape. And if you want to have a cost-effective program and greater bang for the buck, then this is the kind of information you need to utilize. So in this pay-for-performance approach, essentially, even though it's labeled number 2, this area in the circle, science-based models predict less phosphorus. And this is a specific example from a project we did in the Milwaukee River watershed that was focused on phosphorus. We use science-based models to run scenarios for farmers that they might be interested in implementing. And we not only give them the estimated reduction from a specific practice on a specific field, but the cost and the cost effectiveness of a whole set of different actions that they may be willing to take. And then if farmers choose one or more of those and they implement, they generally choose the most appropriate and most cost-effective strategy for their farm and their specific fields. And in the pay-for-performance approach, then farmers can be paid based on those modeled farm-level results. Now, nobody is really fully comfortable with models. In a sense, they're a black box. But what they're doing for us in this situation is applying the most appropriate science to the situation to come up with best estimates for what the losses and the reduction in losses would be, and the farmers are rewarded for that. One of the important upsides of using models in this way is that there's more certainty for the farmer to know, okay, if I make the changes that have been described here, the estimated reduction that I'm going to be paid for is X. And I can calculate the cost of making those changes is going to be Y. And if X is greater than Y, then it's a good business decision for me as a farmer to do those things. Unfortunately, there's greater uncertainty between what the model predicts and what might actually get into the stream, obviously based on precipitation and some other factors that are out of our control. So, as an economist, I'm bound to talk about the theory behind this a little bit. I'm sorry. But essentially, it's another case of market failure, right? There aren't price signals in a pay-for-practice approach, or generally with non-point source pollution. There aren't price signals for the farmers to line up against, to make decisions with, like they do for producing milk or meat or soybeans or corn. And so the performance-based incentive that I was just describing can serve as a price for pollution control. And then if that happens, the outcome that we're hoping is that the environmental performance and environmental management becomes incorporated into farm business planning and decision making. And that's really where we want to get to, because that's the efficient solution, when farmers are taking this into account as they're making decisions for what they do in the field. So we pilot test these kind of approaches in different places, and this is a project we had in Iowa, really in the heart of the Corn Belt. And Robin, I think, was alluding to the line from Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. This work was right outside of Dyersville, Iowa, which is where that movie was set. And I used to use that and still do use that line often. If you build it, they will come. Because this whole approach of pay for performance is, well, when we started on it, it was maybe before people were really ready to think about it. And we kept saying, well, if we set it up, people will come to it eventually. If the models aren't good enough, they'll bring us better models. So what we do with these farmers really is we identify the different actions or scenarios for specific fields. And this is really what's happening on the back of this flatbed truck. with an extension agent from Iowa State University, working with a farmer to talk about what are the things that you might be willing to do on certain fields. With the models, we estimate nutrient loss reductions and the costs, and we provide information back to the farmers that they use in decision making. The farmers, it's a voluntary program, it's an incentive-based program. They can choose not to do any of the things, and that's fine. But we do end up with giving them options for cost-effective changes. Now, I don't have time really to go into detail in this graph, but I have some details on it in a little report here. But essentially, what this graph is showing is that there's highly variable cost effectiveness. Each one of these vertical bars is a scenario from a farm that we worked with. And the higher the bar, the higher the cost per pound of phosphorus loss reduction. And if we had not truncated this graph at $100 such that we could see the texture of it, this right-hand bar would go all the way up to $842 per pound for a specific cover cropping. That'd be putting a winter cover crop on a field. The farmer happened to choose to put a cover crop on some fields that didn't have a lot of phosphorus in the soil already, didn't have a lot of slope, so they weren't losing a lot of soil, and weren't particularly close to surface water, so they weren't high-risk fields. But they still had the cost of the seed and getting that seed in the ground, and so the bang for the buck was very small. It was not cost-effective. It cost over $800 per pound, whereas the other end of the spectrum for cover cropping, there was a strategy in here that cost $29 per pound. So there's huge variability. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the discussion if people are interested. To take the pay-for-performance concept one step further, what we have been trying to do now is go beyond this modeling at the farm that I described a moment ago. And where the rubber meets the road on this issue is, can we reduce the amount of nutrient load that's coming out of the watershed that the farm's in? And what we'd like to do is move the needle there from the gauging station. The reason we don't start with this as a way to offer incentives to farmers is that if you weren't paying them up here based on some estimated reductions and only paying them here, farmers would probably think, well, I could make changes, but maybe my neighbor's not going to make changes, or maybe there's going to be a huge rainstorm and I'm going to have these costs for making changes and I'm not going to get any payment. So we felt, and the stakeholder groups we worked with felt, that wouldn't be a good way to motivate farmers. So what we did do, though, is bring this in as a secondary or bonus payment. And so we have farmers making changes up here and taking action to try to get the payment based on the model results, but then a bonus payment if we move the needle here. And so determining how much that needle has to move is a bit of art and science in itself. But we need more monitoring stations in places so we can do this. And then farmers can get a bonus payment when we do move the needle. Now, the important part about that is several things. Not only it's where the rubber meets the road and the important place where we want to affect change, but if we have this, then we have farmers up here who are participating, who are maybe willing to talk to their neighbors and other farmers who are not participating and say, hey, we're trying to move the needle. We'd like you to participate. And for any of you guys who have worked with farmers, I think you'll understand that that kind of peer-to-peer outreach is much more powerful than anything a non-farmer could bring. So the lessons learned from our work on this, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that remains, meaning there are cost-effective changes that can be made on farms. And I think this is probably more true in some of the less developed country settings than it might be in the US and Canada. We find farmers do use information. They're business people, and they're smart, and they're innovative, and they are motivated by goals. And so moving the needle is more of a goal than just, could you implement this practice for us, please, and we'll pay for most of it. And that they do respond to incentives. And lastly, and again, this is a bit of of the economist in me talking, but the transaction costs of doing this kind of approach. And this transaction costs have to do with the staff time that are required to harness the information that we need, the intensity of the data that we need, and the time it takes to run modeling tools. Those transaction costs need to be less than the benefits you get from the program. Otherwise, what's the point? So this is where we're working now, is trying to make these kinds of programs more efficient, require less time, harness data in more appropriate ways. And that's changing rapidly as information technology and data change. And lastly, I'll just make a plug for this Pay for Performance Conservation how-to guide that we put out last year. It's available online. I'd be happy to share the link with you folks. It's a little too long maybe to write down. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I think it's important to talk about agriculture, and I hope everybody takes away the message that agriculture is the largest polluter, so something has to be done there. Let's just keep in mind one thing, is that if we ask farmers, they are not bad people, if we ask them to pay more because they pollute, well, that will go directly into the price of food. So at the end of the day, it's about all of us accepting to pay more for our food. For us here in the US, it's not necessarily a difficult decision. There are many countries, developing countries, where people struggle, so it has an impact. So that's something to keep in mind. As we try to I think, the other point that I noted from John's presentation is emphasis on data and information. I think the previous speakers also touched upon that. I think it's important, and it links to the trend, the important and essential trend for all of us to work towards more accountability of all actors. As we try to change the way business is done in many places, as we try to change the way governments do things, we try to work with civil society and donors, and civil society try to push for governments to be more accountable, but civil society also has to be more accountable. And the private sector, that we all often forget in the equation, also is part of the equation, is also a factor of change. The private sector, you have some businesses that operate for short-term profits, but you also have lots and lots of businesses around the world that understand what a long-term investment is. They understand what are the reputational and operational risks that can come from water scarcity and water pollution. And I think it's also, I personally believe that it took me a little while to understand that, I will acknowledge, but I believe that as we try to change behaviors, we try to change mentalities, especially in developing countries, especially of local governments, private sector can be a powerful ally to get those to get the point across. So that's why we have invited John Friedman today to represent the private sector, and also to touch upon one point that was made also about the business of water and the business of wastewater, because at the end of the day, the private sector can bring lots of solutions. So John is based in DC, where he leads global government affairs for Suez Water Technologies and Solutions. And previously, John spent 16 years with GE Water and Process Technologies, where he led global government affairs. And I noted also that, John, you were the project leader responsible for the creation of GE's Global Sustainability Initiative. So that's something we want to hear about.
Thank you very much, Eric. And also thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting this event. I'll offer a private sector perspective. Also, how do I advance these charts? Okay, let me just start with maybe a word of context for where I work. How many of you have heard of Suez? Wow, that's really impressive. So we are the world's leading water treatment and waste recovery company. We have 450,000 customers in 130 countries. And Michael Dean used to work there with me years ago. And we have a global water treatment business, it treats virtually every type of water imaginable. So we have one of the largest installed bases in the world of desalination. We also have drinking water plants for cities and wastewater treatment plants for cities. We treat industrial water. So if you go to a semiconductor plant, we will make ultra pure water to wash those chips. But we also go into the oil sands in places like Alberta, Canada, and treat the flow back and produce water that comes back so it can be released safely to the environment. But one of the things we're really focused on is water reuse. And that's because, well, you heard Sasha talk about it, and you heard Robin talk about it, and John. We face tremendous pollution challenges in the world and also water scarcity. And I think, Sasha, you said something like 2/3 of the world's population faces scarcity. One of the ways you can address pollution and scarcity is by treating wastewater, not only so that it can be released to the environment, but actually to a high enough standard so it can be reused for things like what? Running power plants, using it for cooling water, growing crops, and John, you talked about agriculture, and even filling drinking water reservoirs. And that's what we're very focused on. And so we have a full suite of wastewater treatment technologies. And if you take filters and membranes, we can recover 50 to 70% of wastewater so that it can be reused. Or if you go up to thermal technologies, which we call zero liquid discharge, you can actually recover more than 98% of the wastewater so that it can be used productively. And we have lots of examples where we're already using this technology today. So if you fly into LAX in Los Angeles and you drive about 3 miles, you'll come to El Segundo. There, we're taking 30 million gallons of wastewater from the city of Los Angeles and running it through membranes so that it is actually safe to use for drinking. But we're not drinking it directly. We're putting it in the ground to recharge the drinking water aquifers. But here's the thing. Even though we have all this technology, even though we have lots of examples where we're using it correctly, even though we're facing scarcity challenges, globally, I don't know if anybody talked about the percentage, but globally, we're only reusing about 3 to 4% of the world's wastewater today. And even in a developed country like the United States, we're reusing 6 to 8%. So we can do a lot more. So that's why we have released a series of white papers where we're actually highlighting examples of policies governments have already put in place to successfully reuse water. And the white paper you see in the top left quadrant, that highlights 150 examples of policies governments have put in place around the world. And then if you look to the right, there's one focus on Latin America. And I'm on the board of the Water Reuse Association. And we co-released this Latin American paper with the Water Reuse Association. We also released a paper specific to Saudi Arabia. But there are really 4 main things that governments can do to reuse water, to promote more reuse. And one is education and outreach. And Sasha, you talked about it's really important to communicate that this water is safe to use. And so kind of these programs really help make people more comfortable with it. But the second thing is removing barriers. One of the big barriers to reuse is pricing schemes that make no sense. Some utilities actually charge you less per unit of water, the greater volume of water you use. So that actually encourages wasteful use of water. The third thing is incentives. When we ask our customers, why aren't you reusing water, even in cases where communities are facing scarcity, they almost invariably say the same thing. And what is it? What? Water, that's what they say. They say it's cheaper to take more water from the ground or a river or even this potable municipal system where, I hate to say it, but water tariffs are almost universally underpriced, than it is, Suez, for us to buy your reuse technologies and implement them. So by providing incentives, governments can really help communities bridge that economic gap that they're facing today. And we're seeing examples of incentives being provided all over the world. And then the final thing I'll say is mandates and regulation. In some cases, governments are simply saying you have to reuse water in the face of drought. Okay, I just want to give a plug for the Water Reuse Association since I am on the board and Amber Kim is here representing the association. But if you are interested in learning more about water reuse technologies and policies, there's an annual symposium that will be held in Austin September 9th and 10th, and you can check it out. And then I don't have any charts on this, Eric, but you mentioned eco-imagination. Would it be helpful to say a word about kind of a corporate sustainability approach? Look, I think it's important not just to kind of sell water technologies and talk about it, but to actually get your own house in order. And Suez has a tremendous water foundation that provides funding for philanthropy all over the world, but also it uses its water efficiently. And at GE, the program that Eric mentioned was called Eco-Imagination. I was the project leader for the creation of that program. And one of the things GE did was said, look, we're in 160 countries. We're going to reduce our water consumption by 25% over 5 years. Just by virtue of creating that program, GE reduced its consumption by 40%. So I really believe that by shining a light on water consumption, you can actually, and once you understand how much water you're using, you can take immediate measures to reduce consumption and use water more sustainably. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, John. I think we are going to open for questions. First we start in the room, and then we'll. Can we take questions from the audience online? Sorry. Okay. Okay, good. Okay. So why don't we start here with questions in the room? And yeah, there were 4 different presentations, so feel free to go back to the first one or. Yeah. Do we have a microphone for? Yeah. So we have a gentleman here, and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a fascinating series of presentations. Lars Hansen with Levitt Hansen Associates. I'm the Chief Technical Officer and Vice President of that. About 20 years ago in Shinjuku, Japan, which is a suburb of Tokyo, I saw a water presentation there where they are in fact reusing wastewater in a city. We've talked mainly about farms and outside, land, but in urban areas where you have a concentration of people, you have a real need for reusing water. And in Shinjuku, what they've done is they've required, and this is 20 years ago plus that they made the requirement, they required that new buildings going up had 2 water systems. One was for the initial clean water coming in for cooking and for bathing and for drinking. And then they had a second water system which they cycled the treated water back through the buildings for use for gray water usage, which would be like dishwashing and so forth. There's actually was no reason why we couldn't get to use that for drinking as well, except that people were really not ready to accept that quite yet because, what happens if the water treatment plant breaks down? But we haven't really talked about places where there are concentrations of people. John came the closest to mentioning that, John Friedman. Where there are concentrations of people, how do we address that? Because that's a key place where I think we could be reusing water instead of drawing from, several hundred square miles around an urban area. And somebody would like to comment on what examples we're using and what we're doing to address that. I would love to hear it. Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Well, Lars, thank you for your comment about Japan and also the question. And in terms of reuse in urban areas, reuse is one of those things where it's kind of case specific. So some communities actually have more water than they know what to do with, and they're more worried about, gee, when there's a storm, where are we going to put the water so it doesn't overrun our wastewater treatment plants? And other areas are really concerned about absolute scarcity and where are they going to find that next drop of water to send to households. And so New York City would be an example of an area that has kind of a lot of water. And maybe not so focused on water reuse. And Los Angeles would be an example of an area where they really are concerned about addressing the water supplies. And one of the things we're seeing in Los Angeles is there are a number of water reuse facilities that are taking city and county wastewater and treating it so it can recharge groundwater or be used for industrial purposes. And now we're seeing something called the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which is the water agency, it's the wholesale water agency that provides all of Southern California, 19 million people with its drinking water supply. And they are now piloting 150 million gallon per day, which is it's a really big plant, wastewater treatment plant to take city wastewater and treat it for reuse so that it can, in effect, be a source of water supply for all of Southern California. So we're seeing that increasingly in kind of water scarce areas, reuse programs being put in place. And by the way, even in some areas that you might not think of as traditionally water scarce, like Stockholm, Sweden, Stockholm is now building what will be the world's largest reuse plant, 200 million gallons of water per day. So they're going to take all of their city's wastewater and treat it for reuse. And there it's driven by what? Not absolute scarcity, but by a desire to protect the Baltic, which is highly polluted at this point. So.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'll just add a small point here, since we are talking about large cities and concentration of people. There is another type of pollution we haven't discussed this morning. It's rainwater pollution. I mean, when rain falls on the highway, of rain falls over a large city, it's going to collect lots of things, oil residues and garbage, as I mentioned before, lots of things that end up in the rainwater system. And there are many cities where the wastewater system and the rainwater system are separate. And it's been assumed for a long time that you're going to treat wastewater, and the rainwater, you just evacuate it to avoid flooding, and you just dump it into the nearest freshwater or the sea. And what several in many places was research has shown, and now many cities are planning for, is the fact that something has to be done about rainwater pollution. You can't just dump it in the sea, because there is a lot of pollution that comes from that. So I just wanted to refresh our memories, because again, sometimes water is such a wide topic that there's always a small side that we forget. So I just wanted to mention that, because it's very relevant for large cities. Yes, Sasha.
Can I just make a brief intervention in response to the question? Sustainable urban management includes the gray water capture for in a building, if you have a huge building, and then it's very local planning issue. So it is at the municipality level in that. But the storm, in the U.S., the storm overflows, the CSOs are by far the much larger share of the expense. So therefore, we have been, putting out green infrastructure challenges and solutions in municipalities to reduce the immediate rainwater flows into the system, into the rivers or the Chesapeake Bay area. So we brought in a lot of incentive programs for landowners to convert impervious surfaces to pervious. So in other countries and now internationally, it's very much nature-based solutions, but it is very much related to green infrastructure in the cities combined with either reuse of gray water or wastewater.
Thanks, Sasha. We had a couple of questions in front here.
Good morning. My name is David Baxter. I'm a senior advisor to the United Nations Economic Commission's International Resilience Center that's been established in New Orleans in Louisiana. And one of the things that we are looking at is the whole idea of public-private partnerships when it comes to all the issues that you talked about. And there's generally quite a range of how you can define a public-private partnership, from philanthropy to a formal contract to deliver a service, for a fixed fee over a fixed period of time. And the challenge we are finding, and I think you might have experienced it as well, is that in many instances, this confusion of what a public-private partnership is clouds the policies and the approaches to PPPs. So, for example, in my experiences with USAID, they're very much more philanthropy-based. They're trying to get institutions to support what I would call in many cases non-sustainable activities, because as soon as that institution stops supporting that whatever activity it ends, to long-term public-private partnerships which require a considerable amount of expertise, innovation exchanges, and then alternative financing. On top of that, there's another layer of confusion that's often added, is that groups confuse the term partner and stakeholder. Mm-hmm. They mix those up. So you'll hear people talking about forming public-private partnerships, which are vague at times. And then they take, and especially when they try and set up a very formal PPP or a structured alternative financing model, they will invite stakeholders, which shouldn't really be in the equation because they're interested parties, but they're not going to run it and they don't have any commitment, and that causes challenges and creates unrealistic expectations and perceptions, etc. So I was just wondering if there were any comments along those lines, because these are critical, to very, very clearly define what you mean by PPP and very clearly define who a partner is and who a stakeholder is, because that affects the outcome. And then I just want to thank you all for doing a good job. My home city, or my birth city, is the city of Cape Town in South Africa. Oh. And it's going through tremendous problems. And I'll just tell you 2 anecdotes about saving water, which is interesting. My sister says, who lives in Cape Town, says she's designed the most efficient dishwasher in the world. And I said, oh, what is that? It's her dog. She puts all the plates down on the floor and lets the dog lick them clean before she washes anything. And then on a few occasions, I've called her and I said, can I speak to your husband? He says, no, he's out in the yard watering plants. And I was rather confused by what he meant by that. So he was contributing maybe to pollution, but anytime he has to do a number 1, he goes out into the yard and pees on the plants to try and keep them alive. So I thought I'd share that. Thank you.
Yeah, anybody wants to comment on PPP?
Sure, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's really important. One of the, I think, exciting financing mechanisms related to the work that I described that is brand new, and I'd like to see it get some traction, is that it falls under the heading of environmental impact bonds. And so thinking back to the example I was speaking of, where the USDA spends in excess of $5 billion per year to essentially try to solve this problem. And unfortunately, they're not getting too far too quickly. It could be the case that if private sector funding were to come in and work with some groups on the ground who could effectively implement and deliver a pay-for-performance conservation approach with funding from the private sector. And when the milestones of achievement are met, that the government repays the private sector investment, it might be impact investment money, with some kind of a nominal return. And that's, I think, would fall under the general heading of a public-private partnership to some degree.
Mm-hmm. I think, looking at PPPs, there is that first reflex from us, implementers, development specialists, to look at the private sector as a cash cow, and we need more funding. So we go to them and we try to see if they want to fund something that makes them look good. I think we need to look beyond that. For me, because I've worked a lot on river basin management, for me, private sector is, along with the residents, the civil society and the government, is one of the stakeholders. And bringing the private sector to the table when we try to have the local authorities and the local leaders and the local business leaders, if we can have all of them around the table and try to plan together to look at what the water issues are, without necessarily asking the business people to bring any money. They just bring the fact that they are here, that they are part of the equation, that they accept responsibility for the pollution they cause, just like everybody else does, because they are not the only polluters, and they try to provide solutions. And we need to keep, if we have them I've had a couple of experiences where having them at the table really means a lot, because they have leverage. They have leverage with the government, they have leverage with civil society, because they provide jobs. So I think we need to look at the private sector in that way, and not just as, they are philanthropists. They are going to bring money to the table. No, we need to be smarter than that. And that, yes, Sasha.
If I may add, how the EPA's been doing in terms of leveraging up the public funding for a lot of the water projects at the municipality level, and we of course have the state revolving fund allocation to states, and states request them based on a plan, whether they want to increase, there's a scoring of these environmental water-related projects, whether it's increasing green infrastructure, reducing nutrient pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. There are all various type of projects that come forward. So with the public dollars that goes in, the states put into the municipal bond market, and that is where the private financing comes in. So the federal dollars with the 20% matching from the state is put into a dedicated fund for the clean water revolving fund. There's also a safe drinking water revolving fund, but the clean water revolving fund is principally the one that would actually, with the private, financing and investments, that capitalize the project, and then the return based on a lower interest rate than the market interest rate for these projects are returned back to that the revolving fund, and that continues to grow over time. So with the 20 some 30-year experience with the SRF, we have grown to a liquid equity of $60 billion right now for future sustainable financing.
Thank you, Sasha. We had another question here, and then maybe Lauren will take questions if we have some online.
Good morning, and thank you to all of you for being here. My name is Katie Lackey, and I'm with the Water Research Foundation. Several of you had mentioned off-grid challenges in terms of increasing wash and wastewater treatment and reuse, and I think one of the areas that we've also made progress in, at least in the United States and in the urban areas, is a focus on on-site water reuse, specifically for non-potable water consumption. And here that's kind of promoted a resurgence of attention towards decentralized water systems and a blend of centralized and decentralized questions. And I'm curious if any of you are working in that space internationally or see potential for on-site reuse and a blend of decentralized and centralized infrastructure, whether it's in rural areas or kind of the in-between rural and urban, the outskirts of cities and peri-urban areas.
Okay, well, I'll start, Katie. Thank you for your question. There are lots of examples now of on-site reuse, and the technology certainly exists. And there's an example in New York City in the Solaire building. I don't know if anybody knows that, but it's in kind of Battery Park City area, and they're reusing all the water in the building for kind of toilets and things like that, not for drinking. But the water would certainly be safe for drinking. And I think as I speak to kind of government officials around the world, and there's clearly a trend towards decentralized treatment as opposed to kind of the large centralized treatment plants. And the concern typically is, can it be done safely? In other words, if the technology stops working properly, will we know? And I think now through kind of monitoring solutions, which are really becoming prevalent, there is a very good way to know whether a decentralized wastewater treatment and recycling piece of equipment is working properly. So I think this is something clearly on the rise. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, John, you probably have experienced Singapore, which is a
Sure.
very good example outside of the U.S. in terms of their new water, which they actually brand. So there's a lot of that momentum catching up in addressing. And Singapore, besides the new water, which is actually bottled as a sellable product, they also have reuse in a nearby reservoir, which is, again, besides Singapore, Spain, I've done projects in the Llobregat, which is the real, the Barcelona area, in which they have a lot of influx of tourists in the summer months. So they have a lot of these, schemes in which there is reuse, and they have RO built into a specific part of their wastewater treatment plant, and then that is used for groundwater recharge, and then some other portions that has lesser levels of treatment, because for agriculture reuse you don't really need to treat it to tertiary water, so that is diverted to a peri-urban agricultural site. So they use a blended decentralized and centralized system for reuse to address the scarcity, especially in the summer months.
Thank you, Sasha. Do we have some questions? Okay.
I imagine that one of the major hurdles with water reuse is just the education component and getting people comfortable with the idea. So have you guys seen any sort of innovative approaches in communications that can get people on board with the idea of using recycled water?
Sasha just mentioned Singapore, and I think they're really the best example in the world. I mean, they've kind of incorporated water, the importance and safety of water reuse into even their education programs in schools. And they have a huge and very effective public relations campaign around it, and where, Sasha mentioned New Water, it's treated wastewater that's in a bottle. They have government officials who will publicly drink it, and I think that's just a great example globally. But do you have other examples, Sasha, or we've seen other?
Israel, maybe.
Israel, yeah.
Yeah, I think one topic we've touched upon is the issue of behavior change. I mean, accepting the fact that you're drinking your own urine. I mean, if you've ever watched a movie from NASA, I mean, I worked with NASA a while back, and I got that tie. So I'm always interested to see what they have to say. And any movie or any documentary, you know what happens on the space station. I mean, it's the same water over and over. So, and they are comfortable with that. But yeah, behavior change, there is a lot that has to be done. It links also to tariffs, because at the end of the day, people will have to pay for water, and people will have to pay for wastewater management. And that's the only way. I mean, the financial gap we are talking about is not going to be bridged by donors and by philanthropy or etc. Customers will have to pay for it. And an additional thought here is that there is always the thing that, in Africa especially, communities are very poor, refugees are very poor, so they can't pay. Well, maybe. But, so many refugee camps. I mean, I've been in many very poor areas. I was 2 years ago in South Sudan, for example. I've seen refugee camps. They have satellite dishes. I've seen slum cities of Egypt. They have cell phones. Actually, in Egypt, when I was there was a survey looking at what do very poor people spend money on. And poor people spend more money on their cell phone and cigarettes than on water if they are connected or if they have good water. If they don't have good water, then they actually pay pretty high to get water coming to them. So what I'm saying is that we really need to work also and debunk the idea that water should be for free. There should be, of course, tariffs that are socially accountable. But at the end of the day, if we don't make people acknowledge the benefits of water and pay for it, then that financial gap we keep talking about, we are never going to bridge it. So I wanted to make that point. I saw a couple more questions. So first in the back, and then we'll come to the front. Who has the microphone over there in the back? Yeah, he was the first over there, and then Michael will come to you and the gentleman behind.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jorge Tortos. I'm from Costa Rica, which is in Central America, and I work for the government at an Institute of Integral Rural Development. And one of the questions that I have here is based on the agro sector. And I would like to know if there's any type of experience or any type of mechanism, basically with those huge transnational companies that they surely go for developing countries, and they mostly would like to invest and, of course, take the most out of it, natural resources and the human conditions. The thing is that some of the times they do not respect the environmental regulations or so, even though in my country, Costa Rica, we have very high level of sustainable development, but they just go and they do not hear the voice of our country, you know? So they might be hearing the voice of those from the global north. Is there any type of very good examples of what you're seeing, telling to those companies how to, for instance, treat the gray waters or so, because they're not following local regulations. They simply do not care when they're investing. I'm talking about huge banana plantations, can be cocoa or any others. And I would also like to hear any perspective on the role of the youth into this type of, you know, I'm part of Central America Water Youth Association, and we are also like to hear if there any type of recommendation for the youth, how to get involved, especially in developing countries. Is any type of, sometimes there are scholarships, but I'm not talking specifically on that. Some people are getting involved through internet, or they're creating platforms for awareness and education. What type of recommendations can you provide us as well regarding youth and involvement with water, integral water? Thank you.
I can respond, but if anybody wants to jump in, okay, I'll give you I think you basically provided a bit of the response, because you ended up talking about internet. I strongly believe that data and information is the key to improving accountability. I mean, you mentioned Costa Rica. Right now we are working in Cambodia in a watershed where upstream there are some legal concessions. The upstream part of our watershed where we are working is basically a protected forest, but next to the forest and in some parts that it's not clear if it's in the forest or not, in the protected area or not, there are some large plantations. There is a gold mine operated by, I believe, a Vietnamese company, and there are some plantations operated by Chinese companies. Most of those are there to make a quick buck. You know, everybody needs to make a living. There's nothing wrong with that. But of course, they don't really respect environmental regulations. Some NGOs are trying to expose them. Well, first you try to dialogue with them, and then if it doesn't work, you try to expose them using different tools, remote sensing, etc., to show what's going on. If anybody follows the news, about a month or two ago, basically the Cambodian police killed an NGO worker who was investigating too close to a plantation, not in our watershed, in other part of the country. But the issue there is so big that you have the national police killing an NGO worker to basically protect an illegal operation. Okay, well, there's a long way to go. But I think, to me, I don't know if I'm giving maybe a vague and all-encompassing solution, but to me, it's accountability. It's using all the tools we have to collect data and information in a fair and transparent way and protect that online and educating everyone. And at some point, things are changing progressively. Things are changing. I mean, it's amazing that today the private sector in many places is not just a leader in terms of providing technological solutions, like John said, but a leader in terms of changing behaviors, changing the thinking, pressuring governments to do business differently. So I think that's the solution I would offer. Question, Michael.
Thank you very much. I'm Mike Ashford with Comonics. I'm director for the Water and Energy and Sustainable Cities practice there. This is a fascinating discussion. Before my question, just a quick plug. Maybe Sasha, you also know about this. The Clean Rivers Project in the DC area is a major sustainable initiative for stormwater management, which I think, if you're sort of interested in what happens at home, and that can be considered in our international development work, I think that's another great instance of what's happening here locally to clean our own river and water systems. My question is, I guess, more for John and John, about what and looking at ways to innovatively finance a lot of the activities that we're trying to do in countries which are really stressed, of course, economically. It's a little bit more difficult for WASH projects at the level that you were discussing, Robin, but it is relevant there, and I think it ties into some discussions that the World Bank is now bringing up around PPPs and others, is the avoided cost of capacity for treatment, which I know in the work that you're doing, John. I was at Windrock for some time too, and having worked in energy and carbon market development, it's the avoided cost of continued production of clean water, which is actually the source for potential financing for upstream non-point source reductions, or even fecal sludge management in areas where there isn't wastewater treatment systems. Do you know, the question, to get to the question, is do you know, perhaps Suez has some specific examples where that's been captured, the avoided cost of additional capacity and infrastructure, which would be at the margin, possibly, as an economist, I share those views, lower than increased infrastructure development, particularly in those challenging environments or very, very developed and built environments where extra capacity is also marginally more expensive.
I can start with, I think that it's a really important issue that you raise, and going back maybe 25 years now, the New York City water example, I think, is a good one, where they went upstream into their watersheds where they were getting their drinking water from, and they brought a lot of money, and these were marginal dairy farming areas, and they paid to have all of the best management practices that could be implemented, really blanketed the area. And I think in that sense, the program was a success in helping the city avoid costs for upgrades on treatment plants. Related to the presentation I was making, however, it wasn't particularly informed or cost effective because they had enough money just to blanket the land with every BMP possible. But water quality credit trading is increasing in frequency and understanding. The problem is that there needs to be a willingness to pay. Mm-hmm. There needs to be some entity downstream that's going to have avoided costs, which are greater than the costs that would be incurred upstream. And that doesn't exist everywhere. It does exist in some places. Right now in the U.S., there's a big effort in the Ohio River Basin, a big water quality trading program that's happening, and it's being tried in many other places too. I haven't hitched my horses to that wagon only because it is site-specific. And I've been more interested in solutions that maybe could be applied more broadly. But it's a really valuable and an important concept, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. So I appreciate that question.
And Mike, I don't have any specific examples except to say that, I can offer a specific example here in the U.S., Rockland County, New York, where we were looking at possibly the need to build a desalination plant or find a way to promote more conservation, and we decided to spend our time and dollars trying to promote more conservation. And there are lots of examples of things like that globally, but anyway, it was a good question.
Over there.
Thank you. John Mattel, Virginia Tree Farming. After you're done cleaning the water, it leaves biosolids. We love biosolids. They slowly release their nutrients. They build our Piedmont soils. We can't get them because so often they landfill these things or they burn them. I guess mine is not a question, as a plea to put the crap back in our land, please. And because we can absorb as much of it as is produced by all the cities in eastern North America. And it's very good for our soils. Then we retain more water, they'll retain more carbon, and the runoff will be less. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My name is Ellie Anderson. I'm an intern with the Environmental Change and Security Program, and I wanted to thank Robin for her presentation. I just thought it was really relevant and sometimes missing. My question is for John Winston. I know you focused mostly on U.S. examples, but you did touch a little bit on the relevancy of your programming outside of Canada and the U.S. So I'm wondering, in countries where the majority of farmers are women, how have you sort of looked at your programming through more of a gender lens?
That's a great question. Thank you. Unfortunately, the short answer is I haven't really, because I haven't spent a lot of time focusing on agricultural pollution control outside of North America yet. But clearly, in places where farming is done primarily by women, then the audience, you always need to know your audience, whatever it is. And so I think the gender issues really need to be considered quite closely. Unfortunately, any deeper thoughts than that I do not have. I'm sorry.
We'll take one more question, maybe here in front, and then we'll. And John in the back, yeah. Okay.
My question is about more industrial wastewater, like mining. Some kind of mining produce lots of wastewater, and it will ended up to agriculture. So any kind of solution?
Yeah. Anybody wants to take that?
Could you repeat the
Industrial pollution and the impact on agriculture. I think the impact in general on downstream. I mean, what kind of solution?
I know that the USDA is currently focusing on that issue, and there have been a number of grant funding programs that are looking at how to address produced water from mining, to help treat it, get it back into the groundwater without contamination. I haven't been involved in those programs, but it's an important issue, and I know that at least in the U.S. context, they're focusing on it. I assume in several other places too.
Okay. Was there one last question? No? Oh, John over there. Yeah.
Good morning. John Oldfield with Global Water 2020. Lauren, there's a question online as well. Oh, super. Okay, great. Just a couple of quick things. I'm inspired by this I've just tweeted wastewater treatment plants are being rebranded as resource recovery centers. I think maybe Sasha brought that to our attention, but it was seconded by a number of the panelists. Robin, that made me think of WaterAid's work in resilient latrines. Let's say the more human waste is captured, and then hopefully the good parts of it, biogas and fertilizer, the more that's done in a resilient way, the more of an impact that's going to have on water quality. That's my sense, at least. I wonder if you can comment on that, and how do we get not just the CSO sector, the civil society or NGO sector, but the private sector as well, to properly treat human waste at the scale at which the problem merits. Secondly, a couple of folks, and I'm grateful to you guys for bringing up rainwater harvesting. I want to give you all the chance to comment further on rainwater harvesting. It strikes me as though efforts to harvest rainwater across the globe are underweighted, under-recognized in these grand equations here. It also strikes me that if we do a much better job of harvesting rainwater, that there will be a lot of unintended consequences, particularly on water quality, not just on water quantity. So I'd welcome any of you making us smarter on rainwater harvesting as well. Thank you.
Anybody? Yeah.
Okay. So to get at your question about treating human waste and what private investments or how to scale up, I mean, you're absolutely correct that that latrines that are more resilient to flooding would prevent the spread of fecal matter. However, another sector that isn't really touched upon is really fecal sludge management. It's not just about the latrines being fortified, but rather how do we dispose of waste and how do we do it effectively? How do we make use of what the waste actually contains when you dry it, the biosolids, and then use the water and treat the water to make it potable, or even used in at the tertiary level to be reused in agriculture or even in median strips here in the developed countries. I think there's a good example in Dakar that they're looking at fecal sludge management for rural populations, taking sludge trucks to remove sludge from people's latrines in homes that aren't on the piped infrastructure. It's a cost share between the government and the public, the ratepayers. However, there's an influx of interest from I'd say the nonprofit communities and just CSOs in general. But it kind of gets to Mike's question about innovative financing and this concept of how do we achieve this end goal when it's really about the willingness to pay and who will pay. So there is a lot of, I think there's examples out there that really explore that area. However, it's difficult because not only are you taking a gamble on what the technology would be or the most appropriate solution would be for those communities, but also the cost associated with it. We can get a quote for how to build a house, but we all know we're going to end up paying more than what that quote is. So it's that concern, that trepidation that I think governments and all stakeholders have about how best to put up the money, when to put up the money, and what would be the best technologies for moving forward. There are efforts to scale up more of these localized solutions, but I think the question still is outstanding.
Thank you, Robin. One last question. So we got a question from Julien Kachinov from the State Department. He's asking how SWP, our program, is structuring our intervention to deliver short-term tangible benefits. I think it's a very relevant question. I'll try to make it short because it's also something that's at the core of what we try to do. For many years, we, water specialists, on water management, we've tried to promote IWRM, Integrated Water Resource Management. I believe most of you are familiar with the concept. I wouldn't say it has failed, but I would say it was too ambitious. And IWRM, there is that idea that you need to do a very comprehensive assessment of what the situation is. You focus on the river basin. You try to bring all the stakeholders together. You come up with a nice river basin management plan. And eventually you start solving issues. And that usually takes 1, 2, 3 years. And at that point, that's something that works well in the developed world. In the developing countries, they don't necessarily have the patience to stay with you until you reach that nice river basin management plan. And I could give many examples of projects that have come up with the plan and there's no money left to implement anything. So I think today why we talk less about IWRM, although its principles are still relevant. Now we are talking about water security, and us as SWP, if you go on our website, you'll see we have a series of 6 toolkits where we try to promote an approach that's more pragmatic. Doesn't mean you don't do an assessment, doesn't mean you don't do planning. It means that you try to find the right balance between having a good idea of what's going on and at the same time, especially in developing countries where you need to establish that culture and that space of dialogue, you need to quickly zero in on some relevant issues once you've confirmed that these are not just relevant to the people, but technically you can confirm that, yes, these are issues that need to be addressed. And proof being in the pudding, it's a question of rapidly bringing some tangible benefits. And you can do it different way. You can focus on some issues that you know you have the funding to solve. And so that you, I think the point here is by bringing tangible benefits, even if they are small at the beginning, you prove to everybody that it works. You show local leaders, you help them bring something tangible to their constituents so they can justify the fact that they are part of the process. And then once you've started that process, you've solved one issue that was not maybe massive, but it's visible, then you can move on to next issue. Because at the end of the day, what's really critical in this approach is to create that space of dialogue to make sure that you have the provincial authorities, if you're working at that level, with the local leaders, both from communities, farming communities, fishing communities, and the local private sector activities, local businesses, all in a room. And basically what you want to convey to them is that the solution has also to be in the room. They shouldn't expect too much from their central government. They can expect there is some funding, there is some technical support, but at the end of the day, it's a change in mentality. I mean, and I'm speaking about that coming from France, where we expect more from the government than in the US. But it's really that. It's convincing people that they have to take their own future into their own hands, even with their limited resources. And it's amazing how much can be achieved when people work together, opposed to the fact that how little is achieved when you have conflicts. Egos. I've worked a long time in the Middle East, so egos is That's a big issue in the Middle East especially, but in other parts of the world. So creating that atmosphere of we are all in this together. What one of us is doing is impacting the others and vice versa, upstream and downstream. I think the first achievement is when people upstream say, yeah, I realize I'm impacting you guys downstream, so I'm willing to talk about it. It doesn't mean I will pay for all of it because I can't, but let's talk. And once you create that relationship also between the government, who's not necessarily willing to sit with local leaders, and you have also, I mean, it requires working on both sides of the equation because provincial leaders are not comfortable working with the public. I mean, even in the US, it took some, I mean, I found online a 1983 brochure from USDA that says how to survive a public meeting. It shows that at that time they were not ready to go and engage people. So on one side, you need to educate provincial authorities, government officials on how to deal with the public. On the other side, you want your local leaders not to come to the table with their long list of demands and complaints, etc., but as leaders. They should move away from their mentality of beneficiaries to actors. They have limited resources, of course, but there are things they can do. If you bring these two sides together in a cooperative manner, then lots of things can be achieved. Because at the end of the day, the other mentality or behavior change there has to be is that people have to stop thinking in terms of just infrastructure. I mean, we've mentioned it, you are all convinced here, but we really need to convey that to people in developing countries. Behavior change is important. Institutional changes, management changes are important. Green infrastructure is also critical. So if you don't have that set of solutions, you're not going to have sustainable and tangible benefits. I wanted to make that point. How much time do we have left? Okay. Then let's do that. Anybody wants to have a last word or reflection or takeaway messages? If nobody has, I can do it quickly. I mean, I took notes of what each of you said, so I can quickly summarize what to me was the most important of what each of you said. If you want me to dive in, okay, I'll do that. I'll do that quickly. Sorry, I'll have Age speaking. I need that to read better. So first, Sasha, 3 things I liked in what you said, and I need to keep in mind. First, you reminded us that water security, it's a destabilizing factor when we look at economic growth and political stability. And at the end of the day, yes, it leads to social unrest and migration. So we really need to convey that theme so that water is not just thought as something that we drink and we just manage water for the sake of water. It impacts everything. You of course reminded us, we haven't talked too much about that this morning, but climate change. Somebody told me recently, I'm sure you've heard that before, if climate change is a shark, water is its teeth. So yeah, the two are linked, and adjusting to different weather patterns and different water patterns is going to be a huge cost for everyone around this planet, farmers and others. I didn't know that 90% of the wastewater is left untreated in developing countries. I mean, I'm not surprised by that number, but I'm glad that's a number I'm going to use and reuse. I think it's essential. And then you gave us, a list of our solution: reduce, remove, reuse, recover. I think all these are very good points. Robin, you talked about one point. And I just think we also missed talking more about that, but you said water is an entry point for women empowerment, and that's essential. I would say water is an entry point for better governance in general, because when you want to improve anything, when you ask people what are your issues, water comes very often. So water is a wonderful opportunity to bring people around the table. I think we, as water specialists, as we try to convince other development specialists that water is critical also for their activities, they should also think that water can help them do a better job. And I'm especially thinking of my democracy and governance colleagues. So I think that was a very important point. You mentioned the fact that we need to combine technology and behavior change, and the two have to go together. And we won't emphasize enough the fact that when we look at pollution and health, women are the ones who can talk about it and can be, when we want behavior change, I think women are the ones who are willing to listen and talk and change more than men. That's just my point of view. John, I'm glad we brought you here because I think it's really essential to emphasize that agriculture is the largest user of water and the largest polluter of water. I think we won't say it enough because everybody forgets that. I like the fact that you compared prescriptive regulations with incentives. I think we need both. But I think, regulation is necessary, but is not enough. And there is a lot that can be done by encouraging and supporting better behavior. So I think that was a good point. And of course, you emphasize the fact that since we are talking about 9-point source, it's difficult to measure, but it's still important to try to measure. And that's where research can help us provide the data and information we need to better understand what's going on. And then, John, you reminded us first. I like the fact that you made a list of the different types of wastewater, and I think that's also something we haven't mentioned because you don't treat the different types of wastewater the same way. You don't manage it the same way. In many countries, there are wastewater treatment plants that are built for domestic wastewater, and then plenty of factories connect to it because it's convenient, and then you end up with a pollution load that is not adapted, or the plant is not adapted to the pollution load. And at the end of the day, the plant is going to fail. And then nothing is going to get treated. But it's again because there was no thinking of, okay, what am I treating here, and what kind of wastewaters am I treating? So I think that was good. You also gave us some numbers in terms of how much can be recycled, and reminded us that the technical solutions are there. I liked. And it builds on what I was saying. I like the fact that you again emphasize the fact that solutions have to be integrated. Combining education and outreach with better tariffs, incentives, and regulations. All these have to be to come to the table. So in a nutshell, that's what I take away from today. I would encourage you to come to our website, which was shown at some point, swpwater.org. We have those toolkits that you can download from the website. We are also we are producing blogs. We have started doing some webinars. We have one next week. They are pretty short events, 30-45 minutes. Next week, we are going to talk about the work we do in the Mara River Basin, which is a transboundary river between Kenya and Tanzania. It will be on Tuesday. And we are looking into other ways to convey the approaches we are implementing and promoting. We will probably post videos very soon. So I would encourage you to come to our website. And you can also contact us, ask questions, give us your lessons learned, your suggestions, because we don't claim to be the expert on that topic, which is very broad and very complex. This being said, I'm going to thank all of you for attending today, and I'm going to close the session. Thank you.